Elinor grew impatient for some tidings of Edward. She had heard nothing of him since her leaving London, nothing new of his plans, nothing certain even of his present abode. She was not doomed, however, to be long in ignorance of his measures. Their manservant had been sent one morning to Exeter on business, and when, as he waited at table, he had satisfied the inquiries of his mistress as the event of his errand, this was his voluntary communication. "I suppose you know, ma'am, that Mr. Ferrars is married?" Marianne gave a violent start, fixed her eyes upon Elinor, saw her turning pale, and fell back in her chair in hysterics. Mrs. Dashwood was shocked to perceive Elinor's countenance too, and knew not on which child to bestow her principal attention. "Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married, Thomas?" "I saw Mr. Ferrars myself, ma'am, this morning in Exeter, and his lady too, Miss Steele, as was. They was stopping in a chaise at the door of the New London Inn. I happened to look up as I went by the chaise, and so I see directly it was the youngest Miss Steele." "But did she tell you she was married, Thomas?" "Yes, ma'am." "Was Mr. Ferrars in the carriage with her?" "Yes, ma'am, but he did not look up. He never was much of a gentleman for talking." "Was there no one else in the carriage?" "No, ma'am, only they two." "Do you know where they came from?" "They came straight from town, as Mrs. Ferrars told me." "And are they going farther westward?" "Yes, ma'am, but not to bide long. They will soon be back again, and then they'd be sure and call here." Mrs. Dashwood now looked at her daughter, but Elinor knew better than to expect them. She recognised the whole of Lucy in the message, and was very confident that Edward would never come near them. Elinor now found the difference between the expectation of an unpleasant event, however certain the mind may be told to consider it, and certainty itself. In spite of herself, she had always admitted a hope, while Edward remained single, that something would occur to prevent his marrying Lucy. That he should be married so soon, before he could be in orders, and consequently before he could be in possession of the living, surprised her at first. But she soon saw how likely it was that Lucy, in her haste to secure him, should overlook everything but the risk of delay. Elinor flattered herself that some one of her connections in London would write to them to announce the event and give farther particulars. But day after day passed off, and brought no letter, no tidings. Though uncertain that anyone were to blame, she found fault with every absent friend. "When do you write to Colonel Brandon, mamma?" was an inquiry which sprung from the impatience of her mind to have something going on. "I wrote to him, my love, last week, and rather expect to see than to hear from him again." This was something to look forward to. Colonel Brandon must have some information to give. Scarcely had she so determined it, when the figure of a man on horseback drew her eyes to the window. He stopped at their gate. It was a gentleman. It was Colonel Brandon himself. Now she should hear more, and she trembled at the expectation of it. But it was not Colonel Brandon. Were it possible, she should say it must be Edward. She looked again. He had just dismounted. She could not be mistaken. It was Edward. "He comes purposely to see us. I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself." His footsteps were heard along the gravel path. In a moment he was in the passage, and in another he was before them. His countenance as he entered the room was not too happy even for Elinor. Mrs. Dashwood gave him her hand and wished him joy. He coloured and stammered out an unintelligible reply. A very awful pause took place. It was put an end to by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt obliged to hope that he had left Mrs. Ferrars very well. In a hurried manner he replied in the affirmative. Another pause.